We are going to do Teammate Wars, the first running of the Tired F1 pod, Teammate Wars. Mercedes-Benz AMG F1 Performance, I think. Is that what they're called?
I mean, we haven't seen another sponsor come in just yet,
I don't know. I mean, if Lewis can't even remember what the name of his team is, then what chance do we have?
Cheeky
Anyway,
that you got that
anyway,
in.
so teammate wars at Mercedes, Lewis Hamilton versus George Russell. Last year's championship standings, Lewis Hamilton finished third, George finished eighth, but in the qualifying, head to head, 11 all. Who comes out on top, Amon?
Oh goodness, I am very conflicted about this, if I'm being honest, right? I mean, I think there's the sentimentality, the romance of Lewis having been with Mercedes for a decade now, right? And everything that he has meant to that team and what they have meant to him. And I think everyone's saying the right things coming out in and into the start of this season, which is that we're fully behind, making sure that we're at the front, aka we'll do everything to support you, Lewis. But I cannot imagine that sentiment would hold on as the season moves forward, right? I would suspect that starts to wane away as we start thinking about what 25 looks like. And so my guess is that the car is going to go. I don't know if it goes away from him, but I think it will go more towards George as the season passes. And I could see George coming out on top. If I'm George, I want to do everything I can to establish myself in because it's not Lewis Hamilton I'm competing against, right? I'm competing against that other guy who's racing in F2 that everyone keeps talking about. Like that's already put pressure on him. So I think this will be an interesting season. In the end, though, I think I would pick Lewis to beat out George because I think he's gonna want to end out on a high. I think he'll do everything right. I mean, unless the team asks him to, be second fiddle to George at some point, for which you really have to be in the mix for the championship in any way, which is really hard to see. If those scenarios present itself, then I can see Lewis taking a step back. But I imagine that Lewis will want to end this on a high note, and which means beating out George.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is definitely the spiciest teammate pairing on the grid. I think the crux of this comes down to how competitive that W15 is going to be. We're recording this just as FP2 finished and in Bahrain, and the finishing order in that, as you know, as vague as the findings of that are, is that Lewis finished first, George finished second, Verstappen finished sixth, um, half a second back. So if we're into that scenario where this is a competitive car that's gunning for a championship, then it's going to be very, very interesting. I think if the car is not competitive, then we'll see Lewis, his motivation to do as well as he can will still be there. But we saw at the end of last season that he tailed off a little bit because there was, you could tell that he just sort of lost interest, and he was kind of focusing on the next season, and although he'll still want to show Ferrari that he has that fire within him, whether, as if that's really in any doubt. I think if the car is not competitive, it'll be harder for him to keep that motivation. Whereas George really does need to show that he's better than the guy leaving, and that, Kimi Antonelli, if he's coming in 2025, is going to have a massive uphill challenge. In terms of what the car is going to do, look, I understand what you're saying about the car sort of being developed further towards George, but the indications at the moment, like Russell has actually um, been on record ahead of free practice saying that the Mercedes technical team listened to Lewis, and they moved the center of aero rearwards. They moved the cockpit rearward. They
Mhm.
did the stuff
Mhm.
that Lewis had asked for. Um, and and now the car is a much nicer beast to drive. In fact, his words in testing were, "It feels more like a race car now." So, so you can't discount the fact that Lewis has a huge amount of experience. He has experience in being up against a teammate that's fast and is hungry and wants to beat him badly. He knows how to deal with that, and he has done for the past two seasons. Okay, he got beaten in 2022, but we know there were massive caveats to that with all of the experimentation that he was doing at the beginning of the season, because that season completely switched on its head towards in the second half. And in 2023, He he was the lead Mercedes driver, even though you could tell he wasn't really interested by the end of it. So you kind of have to wonder if that's what's going to happen this season. If he has that drive and the car is up for it, and he's sort of pushed the development direction over the winter, then could be fireworks. But I think Lewis has the experience, the pace, the hunger, that desire for the eighth to do it. But I can't say that as a guarantee. I think that Lewis can do it, and I think he will.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think that the beauty of this conversation is the amount of variables are just so many, right? I mean, one of the things to consider is where is Toto Wolff's head at with all of this, right? If he is bringing Kimi Antonelli in 25 or maybe even 26, right? And they are looking at regulation changes. I mean, we're starting the 2024 season, but realistically, how are Mercedes in a position to compete for a championship? And then at what point do you sort of give up on the idea of trying to compete in this set of at this stage in these regulations, right? And then just start maybe start working your way towards 26 because Red Bull are so far ahead, or maybe Ferrari and McLaren have made those jumps so far ahead that it's hard to envision a probable scenario in which that could be achieved. And I think that's a very interesting thing with an outgoing driver, not the least of which is a seven-time champion, almost eight-time champion, as you said. I think it's interesting, but it's hard to imagine Lewis sort of giving up on it, because it's not been in his nature to sort of mail it in either.
Yeah. What I will say though is that George has got some very specific things that he needs to do. I think his one lap pace has been outstanding over the past two seasons. He's arguably been the quicker driver over one lap. And if you take the pace advantage, he has been slightly quicker than Lewis, right? If you take the qualifying head-to-head out of it, his actual average qualifying pace has been slightly quicker than Lewis's. But that's in a car that's recalcitrant, that neither driver has said has been absolutely perfect and easy to drive. And I think if the car is a more optimized package, I think Lewis will get more out of it because that's what he's shown that he's good at in the past. So I think that qualifying pace will be something that he needs to maintain. And it's going to be harder for him to do that in a car that is absolutely nailed. It's the one thing I haven't seen from George yet. I've seen him pull out really good qualifying performances in under par cars, below par cars. But whether he can do it in a championship winning car, I don't know. But he needs to cut the mistakes out in the races. Canada, Singapore, Vegas.
Yeah.
All of those were, if you do those enough, you're not going to win a championship, especially against somebody who's as consistent in the other car as Lewis. And I know he had issues this season as well, but overall, he brought the car home in higher positions more often than not. And he has to nail that advantage that he's going to have towards the back end of the season, where Lewis is going to start getting excluded from technical meetings, development meetings, all of those things. He needs to really make sure that he's the guy that they're listening to. And if there's a deviation in development direction, that he's the one driving it. The team will want to listen to him because he's their future ultimately. But he needs to really, really be on it. And all the indications are really that George will do that because he's a very pushy character. You've heard him in the cockpit and you've heard him in debrief. So I'm sure that that's what he will do. So conclusion there that we think by a slim margin, Lewis is probably going to win this one. And George just needs to make sure he cuts some mistakes out and really, really doubles down on being Merckx the guy.